The main social and economic causes of violence, and I'll add political causes, are those that divide the population into the superior and the inferior, the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor. The more highly unequal a society is, the higher its rates of violence. For example, the most powerful predictor of homicide rates throughout the world, and this has been repeated in dozens of studies, is the size of the gap between the rich and the poor. The greater the degree of economic inequality in a society, the higher the murder rate. The lower the rate, the lower the inequality, the lower the murder rate. For example, in the world today, the countries with the lowest rates of economic inequality, or in other words, the highest rates of equality, are the countries of Western Europe, Japan, and the other English-speaking democracies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They have the lowest rates of inequality, and they have murder rates that are, in most years, well, in Western Europe and Japan, are roughly a tenth of ours. And in the other English-speaking democracies are about a fifth of ours, 20% as high. In other words, the US murder rates are 5 to 10 times higher than that of any other economically developed country on earth. Now, one reason for that, the United States also has by far the highest degree of economic inequality of any developed economy in the world. The two go together. In the third world countries, the so-called developing countries, although in many cases these are what I would call undeveloping countries or regressing countries, because many of them are actually becoming more poverty-stricken rather than less. But in many of those countries, the rates of inequality are even higher than they are in the United States. I mean, in many of the third world countries, the population is really divided between a tiny elite of super rich landowners and a huge population of semi-starving peasants. And they do have higher rates of violence than we do. I mean, the World Health Organization, with whom have worked for many years, has done really path-breaking epidemiological research on this, and has shown that the highest rates of violence of all are found in the third world countries. By the way, this applies to warfare as well as homicide. Mm-hmm. It's true with both interpersonal violence and collective political violence. So achieving a greater level of equality is important. In fact, it's essential. The US, I can't emphasize it too strongly, has the highest rates of violence in the developed world today. It's important for us, I think, to learn from that what is not working in our society. And I as I said, I'm a doctor, and I approach this as a problem in public health and preventive medicine.
Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Our guest today on The Radical Imagination has devoted his career as a psychiatrist to studying the problem of human violence, trying to discover the causes, cures, and prevention in individuals and in populations at large. From that perspective, wars and genocides are epidemics, and world wars are pandemics of individual homicides and suicides. There's no issue more important that threatens our survival. If we're unable to prevent the continuing rise of violence, we'll follow the road to become the first species in the history of human evolution to become extinct by means of our own behavior. The world after violence would not exist, since there would be no humans left to continue. That image is so difficult for people to grasp, to comprehend. And those people who are, in a sense, the most normal, mentally healthy, and nonviolent are exactly the ones who find it most difficult to comprehend. Comprehend how hateful and mad some individuals, political leaders, and whole nations can become. To be sure, nothing is inevitable. The other road for our continued survival will depend on our ability to prevent or at least control the age-old propensity to kill as many people as possible, even when that results in our own death. Humankind is at a crossroads. Our guest today, Dr. James Gilligan, an internationally renowned violence expert, is in the forefront of scholarship and activism to help lead us to a world as it would look if we could prevent violence. Jim is clinical professor of psychiatry and an adjunct professor of law at New York University, prior to which he taught for 30 years at Harvard Medical School. He is the author of the influential Violence, Our Deadly Epidemic and Its Causes, Preventing Violence, Why Some Politicians Are More Dangerous Than Others, and most recently, Holding a Mirror Up to Nature, Shame, Guilt, and Violence in Shakespeare. Much of our discussion will be on Jim's forthcoming book, After Violence, Humanity at a Crossroads. On a personal level, Jim is a cherished friend and comrade, a fellow traveler and mentor who has demonstrated and showed how true scholarship and an activist life of moral integrity can in fact coexist and indeed flourish, leading to a more complete understanding of the complexity of human behavior and the radical imagination. So thank you so much, Jim, for being here. It's just wonderful to see you again and to discuss some of your recent work and your forthcoming book and what you hope to accomplish and what you have been writing about recently and what you hope to accomplish in that forthcoming book. So again, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Jim. Well, to explain what I've devoted my life to doing. You're right. I've really devoted my career as a psychiatrist to attempting to understand the causes and prevention of human violence, by which I mean the infliction of physical pain and injury, including lethal injury, on a human by a human. This includes lethal injuries such as homicide and suicide in individuals, and includes lethal collective political violence, as in war and genocide. Now, I've used prisons in America and around the world, and jails, as my, you might say, psychological laboratories in which to learn about these things by working therapeutically, clinically, with individuals who have committed homicides, sometimes multiple homicides, or serial homicides, or war crimes. Worked with the World Court in The Hague on that. What I've discovered was that what I thought I knew when I first went into the prisons to run mental health services for the Massachusetts prison system when I was at the Harvard Medical School. But virtually everything I thought I knew going into that was wrong. And I had to rethink everything that I had originally thought. I had assumed in advance that people who committed acts of violence, like murders, and even non-lethal violence, aggravated assault and battery and armed robberies and so forth, and rapes, I had assumed that these were people who had simply never formed a moral value system, that they were simply amoral, but they'd never learned the moral codes and value judgments and the moral commandments that regulate the lives of the rest of us. And I was astonished to find, once I got into the prisons, that I had never seen a group that was more preoccupied with moral questions. They could hardly talk about anything else, about injustice and unfairness, about how unjustly and unfairly they had been treated from earliest childhood by parents, in schools, by the police in the community, by their age mates, sometimes other gang members in the community, and by correction officers in the prison system. They cared more about attaining justice than I or any of my friends did. They made it clear they'd rather die than submit to injustice and unfairness. Now, of course, what they were concerned about was they felt they were the victims of injustice, not the perpetrators of it.
Right.
But the fact is, that was not completely wrong.
Right.
I had never seen or heard of a degree of child abuse as severe as I heard from virtually every one of the violent men I worked with. I just hadn't expected this. The very first man I worked with had look, it was clear he had a broken nose. His nose was crooked. And he said his father did that to him, and his father abused everybody in the family, including my inmate patient's mother. And I thought he was giving me a sob story. I thought he was making all this up so I'd feel sorry for him and help him get out early or something from the prison. Then I discovered that his father was in the prison at the same time, because he had been convicted in a court of law of having murdered his own daughter. That is my inmate patient's sister.
Right.
So after that, I just heard this kind of thing over and over again. I learned that the most violent of the inmates in the prisons were the ones who were the survivors of their own attempted murder, often at the hands of a parent. I saw one man who had been sent to us from a state in the Southwest, where he had been put in prison because he had killed several people in the community. And then he was in prison, and that prison system had the worst riot in its history, during which time he killed people in the prison. So they sent him to Massachusetts, which is what states often do when they have an incorrigible inmate, send them to another state's prison system. So when I met with him in my office in the Massachusetts prison, I saw that he had not only distorted bones, indicating fractures that hadn't been properly taken care of, but also his body was covered with scars and so forth. So I asked him about these. What he described is how his mother had thrown him out the window, had set him on fire, had attacked him with an axe, at different times. And he said, more with a sense of puzzlement than bitterness, he said, I guess she wanted to kill me. I just didn't die. But of course, what he learned from that behavior was that that's the way you treat people, that he was entitled to do that, and in one sense, even obligated to do it, to rescue his own self-esteem, so show that he could not be victimized by others, by showing that he could victimize them instead. So, but they justified this as they were achieving justice. My colleagues and I used to say, you never meet a guilty man in prison. And what we meant by that was not that they denied they had committed the act for which they had been sent to prison, but rather that they were perfectly justified in having done that act, that the person they had killed or injured deserved it. So in other words, they had a moral justification for doing it. They were only doing what somebody deserved. That's a moral argument.
Right.
So we had to realize that what was causing these men to commit what we call their crimes was what they called their attempt to achieve justice in the world, and that they were willing to sacrifice their liberty and even their lives to do that. And those were not just empty threats. The death rate among violent criminals is much higher than it is among their age mates in the general population.
Yeah. And as you're speaking, Jim, my thoughts turn to political leaders around the world who use the same mindset, don't they? Justifications, rationalizations, distortion.
Absolutely.
So
literally the same justifications.
Right. So the same dynamics are occurring there. And of course, we all do that. We all try and rationalize or deal with our choices in various ways. So what brings these people to the point where they are so violent, and what brings us to the point of political leaders being able to manipulate and control and get millions of people to get so angry at each other to justify wars, endless wars, and so on. So we are operating under at individual levels, at collective levels, at political levels, and the last point I'll just throw in here is you yourself, of course, have met all kinds of resistance by various political leaders, knowing full these are basically bright, intelligent human beings, and yet they know that your work has brought about a dramatic reduction in violence, and yet they resist it. They use it politically in a way that they think will get them reelected, and it just gets crazier and crazier.
I totally agree, and that has been my experience with one political system after another, both in this country and around the world. One thing I would say is that when I would ask an individual violent offender why he had committed his act of violence, I would almost always get the same answer in one set of words or another. He disrespected me, or she disrespected me. And they use that term so often, they abbreviated it into the slang term, he or she dissed me. And it occurred to me that when people use a word so often, they abbreviated it. It tells you how central it is in their moral and emotional vocabulary. What I concluded from that was that disrespect, which I'd say is a synonym, to be disrespectful is a synonym for being insulted, treated with disdain, shame, humiliated, treated as inferior, treated as worthless, and so on. And what I concluded, because I heard this over and over again, in fact, I've worked with thousands of most violent men our societies produce. I've never met one yet whose violence was not motivated by the wish to undo or prevent being shamed and humiliated. When they had not been able to do so adequately, they would describe themselves as having died inside themselves, died as a personality, that they'd lost the capacity for feelings, for feeling alive. and they would try to resurrect their dead selves by means of violence. Now, I originally got into this work because Massachusetts was having an epidemic, a really war zone level of violence throughout its prison system. Riots, hostage taking, homicides, suicides, mass rapes, fireside. I mean, everything you can imagine.
Right.
So both the Massachusetts Supreme Court and a federal district court both ordered the state to let a team from the Harvard Medical School into the prisons to see if we could prevent this epidemic of violence. And we succeeded in doing it. But we did so not by punishing these men, but rather by treating them with respect rather than disrespect. Because it was clear to me that it was disrespect that made them violent. And maybe if they were treated with respect, they would stop being violent. And even just as important, if not more so, if they were given access to nonviolent resources by means of which to gain self-respect,
Right.
such as education and the degree of mental health resources, psychotherapy, and so forth, that could help them overcome their feelings of inferiority. And what I found was that worked. We went from these epidemics of lethal violence. We could go for a year at a time without a single homicide or suicide throughout the entire prison system for a year at a time. And we got permanent prevention of any riots and any hostage taking after we had been able to put our programs into effect. But then what happened was, what's happened every time I've done things like this, I've succeeded in doing 3 different programs, so that equally difficult with equally great results. What I found was that the politicians involved would, instead of incorporating this system and trying to universalize it and support it, they dismantled it. When the federal and state courts withdrew their oversight from the work I was doing in the Massachusetts prison, our new governor, who just happened to be a Republican, said that the program that we had found that was most successful in preventing violence, namely enabling prisoners to get a college degree while in prison, that should be dismantled, because otherwise people in the community who were too poor to go to college would start committing crimes so they could get sent to prison to get a free college education.
And this was Governor Weld, right?
Governor William Weld.
And highly educated, sophisticated.
Oh, yeah. Of course, he knew this was nonsense.
Right, he knew it was
He also knew it would get votes.
Right.
And it would appeal to people who didn't really know the first thing about either the causes or prevention of violence. But then I thought, this happened again in the city of Boston. I was part of a committee that created programs that prevented epidemic of youth violence. We went to the point where youth homicides had doubled and even tripled in the city of Boston over a few years. So the police commissioner asked for our help in solving this problem. We succeeded in going more than 2 years without a single youth homicide in the city of Boston, which people sometimes call the Boston miracle. And, It was copied in some places around the world. But what happened was then the city dropped it, as if we had solved the problem, but also because people find it very hard to give up the idea of punishment. And that also, I think, is related to the degree to which people think of violence as a moral and legal problem rather than as a problem in public health and preventive medicine, including preventive psychiatry.
Right. And fast forward to Rikers as well, that you were involved in. You had another politician. It was all right. De Blasio at that time, right? Pulled the rug underneath from the programs or the recommendations that you made.
Well, actually,
how did that work? Or
yeah, yes, I did. I was asked by the New York City Board of Correction to write a report as to whether the Rikers Island, the Department of Correction, was providing the minimal mental health standards they had required. So I investigated it, spent much time at the jail, along with colleagues, and wrote a blistering report. And far from mental health reports, they were actually causing mental illness, not curing it. People were becoming suicidal, depressed, psychotic, and so forth. But de Blasio didn't oppose that. I mean, the mayor's office supported the idea, but the problem was, I would recommend just demolishing Rikers Island, the jails, and replacing them with small jails in the different areas of the different boroughs of New York City. And well, actually, I wasn't I didn't go to the details of that. There were a lot of people who picked up on the notion that we needed to do that. But the mayor approved that, but then couldn't get the people, many of the people in those boroughs, to accept the idea of having a jail in their own borough, even though, as we pointed out, the people who'd be in them were people who had been living in the borough before they were put in jail. Right. So it was their own children, and that we were talking about. So there's been. So my question is, given that we know how to prevent violence, I've shown that 3 times in the prisons of Massachusetts, the city of Boston, and a program in the jails of San Francisco, which was so successful that we won a major national prize from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard for what they call innovations in American governance. We showed how you can prevent violence, that it can be done. In every single case, these programs are either diminished or abolished. And I had to ask, why was there so much resistance to programs that were nonviolent and non-punitive, access to education and therapy? When we showed that made the whole community safer, we showed it saved the taxpayers money because it reduced reincarceration rates, and it was very expensive to have somebody in jail or prison for a year. And what I concluded was the opposition to these programs that actually succeeded in preventing violence was on grounds of morality.
Yeah.
That justice required punishment, not education and therapy. And
the use of those commandments, rooted in that sort of morality, you've argued, is the main cause of violence.
Yes. So it's like what they were doing, we showed that these men had become violent because they had already been punished as severely as it is possible to punish somebody without actually killing him. As I said, many were the survivors of their own attempted murder or of the murders of their closest relatives. And yet the idea here was the way you would prevent violence is by redoubling what caused it.
Yeah.
And that's just crazy. It's like you want to cure alcoholism by depriving people of anything to drink except alcohol. I mean, it's like to cure the problem, redouble the cause. It's just crazy, but that's what we've been doing.
Is that what you mean, Jim, when you say that sort of morality is simply another name for neuroses?
What I mean is this. I regard violence, as I said, violent, homicide, mutilation, beatings, rapes, physical violence against people as a public health problem. It causes death, it causes disability as much as any medical illness does. So I treat this I see this as a public health problem. Now, the moral approach is totally different. It says that the solution has got to be justice, and justice can only be attained by means of violence. I mean, the moral philosophers have said this for years. John Stuart Mill said, we don't call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished for doing it.
Right.
Whereas what I would say is, I know that people usually think that the only way you can prevent violence is by punishing people for doing it, and that will then deter them from doing it. I discovered how naive and mistaken that view is. Punishment actually is the most powerful cause of violence that we have yet discovered. But that doesn't mean that we need to unlock the prisons and let people who are still dangerous into the community. It means we need to treat them differently once we have isolated them from the community, and instead of punishing them, give them access to nonviolent resources to gain the self-respect they need in order to feel that they don't need to humiliate other people by means of violence, which is the purpose of violence.
That follows that you would use the same dynamics and techniques to prevent it in the first place.
Yeah.
That's what people need.
Yeah.
Kids and young teenagers and so on.
I mean, it's just, but we know that, for example, the more severely children are punished, the more violent they become, both as children and as adults. We have a century of research on child development that shows that. I saw in the prisons that the more severely inmates had been punished in their childhoods, those were the most violent inmates. I mean, it's a direct association that's been shown over and over again. Now, my sense is, it was clear that that morality is the cause of violence. That is the search to attain justice, as I said, is what motivates the men who commit the crimes to commit the actions that they do, because they think that's the way to achieve justice for themselves and to undo the injustice that has been inflicted on them by others.
And the authorities, the police and the correctional officials, feel they're doing justice by putting these people in and using punitive measures to control them.
That's right. What's ironic here is the psychology of punishment is the same as the psychology of crime. The motivations for punishment are the same as the motivations for crime, except for that what we call crime is what the legal system calls, illegal violence, and what we call punishment is what the criminal justice system calls legal violence. So they're both violent, but one is called illegal, the other is called legal. But in terms of public health and preventive medicine, they equally cause injury and death. I mean, people are just as dead from capital punishment as they are from what the legal system calls murder. So the problem with morality is that it tends to lead to the idea that let the punishment fit the crime, an eye for an eye, a tongue for a tongue, and on and on. And what I concluded was that the main cause of violence is morality, so we needed some nonviolent solutions like education and therapy. And then what that creates is the capacity to be motivated not by the legal emotion, the moral emotions, shame and guilt, but rather by love, including, first of all, by people have enough self-love because they have self-respect, because they are more educated and they have become able to understand themselves better and understand what has motivated them to do things that were self-destructive as well toward them as well as destructive toward others.
How would, if I could ask you, what would you say to the victims of the Tree of Life synagogue and now the verdict to now execute? What would you say to these family members if you have to try to, and this comes from the, if you will, I guess, the more hardline punitive doctrines within the Hebrew scriptures that I'm sure they feel very, very justified in doing this. So what would you say?
This way. I'm trying to provide a different way of thinking about violence.
Right.
The moral way of thinking is trying to answer the question, how evil was this perpetrator of violence and how much punishment does he deserve? Well, what I'm saying is, even if we could answer that question, even if we could prove that our answer was correct to those moral questions, they wouldn't help us, the answers wouldn't help us in the least to understand what we really need to know, which is what caused them to engage in this behavior, so that we can learn how to prevent it. So that instead of punishing somebody after he has killed people, we can prevent him from killing people in the first place by providing him with alternatives and incentives to not just to kill people, but actually to love them. What I learned in the prisons and jails was that once the men we worked with had been treated with respect and had been given access to nonviolent means of gaining self-respect, they spontaneously, independently of us, started helping other people. One multiple murderer whom I thought would kill people even in prison, not just in the community, when I first saw him, I thought he would be untreatable. Actually, after being treated with respect and not treated violently by us in our facility, he spontaneously chose to protect a very violent but profoundly retarded young man who was also in this prison mental hospital at the same time. He would accompany him to the dining hall and so forth to protect him to make sure that he would not be beaten or threatened or robbed or raped or anything else by the other people in the facility. And in this San Francisco program, the inmates spontaneously, once they'd had access to education and therapy, they would start meeting the new inmates who were coming in to inform them about what they had learned about themselves. And they say, you don't need to be violent here. We don't treat each other that way. Right. And they started wanting to start leading the therapy groups themselves. So we said, great. And we would train them with role playing and supervision. And they became excellent therapists themselves,
Hmm.
which is, actually, ironically, all we were doing was like, reinventing the wheel. Alcoholics Anonymous, discovered that principle,
Right.
long before we did. That sometimes the best therapist is the person who has suffered from the same problem. And so what I'm saying is there are many alternatives to punishment that are much more effective. And when these guys were in the jail, they didn't perceive their being there as punishment. One of the inmates said to me, he said, "Doc, I should be in this program for 4 years, not for 4 months, because I'm trying to change the habits of a lifetime."
Hmm.
They saw themselves as having been given an opportunity to learn how to be human, how to live successfully, how to stop this behavior, hurting other people and themselves. Because actually, in the long run, violence doesn't just hurt the victim; it hurts the perpetrator. Because after all, these guys are in jail or in prison, and their own lives had been ended. They'd been subjected to social death, you might say.
Yeah.
So my thought is, if anybody says that we're being soft on crime or not giving these guys what they deserve, what I would say is we care more about the victims than you do, because all you who want punishment want is to punish somebody after he's killed somebody.
Right.
We want to get involved with somebody before he's killed somebody,
Right.
so that there aren't any victims to have to get revenge for.
Right. And the brief feelings of some sort of respite through vengeance is so short-lived and will not, of course, bring the person back. So yours is a much more constructive, transformative way that would help the victim. I'd love for you to comment briefly on this. I don't know if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer yet, but I know you know the story. You've probably seen the play a few years ago. This was an article that came out in the Times Tuesday, August 1st, and it's entitled "A Symbol Evoking Both Pride and Fear." And just last couple of short paragraphs here. Oppenheimer, directed by Christopher Nolan, presents the latest entree in which the movie depicts the chronicle of the Manhattan Project's explosive results. We do see the traditional rising plume, but at a certain point, this turns into an IMAX-sized wall of flame, blotting out the landscape. It's a fearsome sight, yet the reaction shots of the observers are just as important. Cillian Murphy's title character, Oppenheimer, who is more or less haunted by subatomic particles, even in his dreams as a student years earlier, looks briefly disarmed or stricken by the sight of the blast. We hear the famous words from Bhagavad Gita, but in Nolan's telling, they've been previously uttered in a widely different context, and this is the point I wanted to get at, that suggests the atomic bomb as the ultimate psychosocial release. It's a depiction that manages to fulfill and tweak expectations at the same time. Nolan returns the nuclear explosion from the realm of symbolism to the primal zone of fears and urges, a cataclysm created by other human beings like us. So I just wondered if you, in listening to that, have comments. Do we have some sort of mechanism that we're looking for the ultimate psychosocial release, and the bomb is part of that? How do we, if in fact there's some element of truth to that, how do we restructure people's emotions and feelings about that? So,
I would hope. Well, I'd say two things. One is that we also need to recognize the degree to which there are social and economic and political structures and policies that have the effect of exposing entire populations to shame and humiliation. I think, for example, the degree of economic and social inequality in our society and the much higher degrees of inequality in many other countries are among the major causes of not only individual violence, but of collective political violence like wars. For example, Hitler was able to whip up enthusiasm for Nazism and violence and World War II by saying that he was going to undo the shame of Versailles, that is, the shame and humiliation that he felt that the entire country of Germany had suffered from the terms of the peace treaty that ended the First World War. And I could give, dozens of other examples of this, but one thing that runs throughout the history of political violence and warfare and genocide is that it is always caused by collective feelings of shame and humiliation, some of which, of course, are, I want to say, the collection of which are concentrated and focused by a leader. Vladimir Putin today has made it clear why he's in Ukraine, because he said the Russian people will not tolerate humiliation to, pardon me, to Russia's national pride.
The interesting thing is the lack of even a discussion about bringing an end to this war, ceasefire negotiations, our role in antagonizing, etc., is really lost. The candidates who are most articulate about ending warfare, Cornel West, and whatever else you think of Robert Kennedy, these and Marianne Williamson, of course, are the candidates that are speaking out against us, that are beginning to talk your language, Jim. And yet you see, particularly in the case of Robert Kennedy, but Cornell too, they are trying to shut off that debate. In fact, they won't allow that debate to occur and dialogue. And again, that's just, in order to break through and to change these patterns, we at least need to have this dialogue, which you so courageously are carrying on in your field as well. So what political hopes do you see in terms of social movements and getting the energy toward creating the transformative movements of love that you and, of course, Cornell talk about? Justice is what love looks like, in public. That's what we'll be talking about, and healing people and transforming people. And yet we are both candidates, the presumptive Republican candidate and Trump and Biden, of course, aren't having any of that. And so the leadership that we are lacking has to be taken up in some way by other forces and other social movements and whatever political leadership speaks out against that. Would you agree?
Well, I mean, I think the political situation is probably more complex than I can begin to do justice to in a short space. What I would say is I am in favor of any political individual or group or party that is devoted to minimizing the degree to which human individuals or groups are subjected to shame and humiliation,
Right.
to being treated as inferior. I think we have two choices: democracy versus autocracy. And I'd say really morality versus love. We only need morality when we don't love, because if you love someone, you don't need moral commandments telling you to treat them well. You spontaneously want to do so. That's what love means. And I'd say the problem with morality is it actually inhibits the capacity for love. When shame is the motive of the morality, it inhibits love of other people, because shame consists of a shortage of self-love. The opposite of shame is pride, which is self-love. So shame is the absence of self-love. And that motivates people to not love other people, but to get all the love they can for themselves. Guilt.
And the inability to love is one of the cruelest things that a person has to face and deal with.
Yes. And in fact, the ability to love is a normal, natural human ability. All babies are born with the capacity and the wish to bond with their mothers and their other caregivers, and to form attachments to the people that take care of them. And through that, and by identifying with them, they learn the joys of loving other people. Because you can't enjoy a person if you don't love them. And if you don't love people, you have no joy in your life.
Yeah.
That is a definition of psychopathology and neurosis. Freud said that, neurosis is the inhibition of the capacity to love. Dostoevsky said, hell is the suffering that is caused by the inability to love. Those are two ways of saying the same thing. One in kind of theological language, and the other psychological language.
So Jim, give us an understanding of the relationship between individual and collective violence.
Good question. Ironically, I would say they have the same cause, but they occur in different contexts. I'd say the universal, necessary cause of violence is shame and humiliation. When people feel humiliated or insulted or treated as inferior, treated with contempt, disrespect, they become angry. And if they're angry enough, they will act that out with a violent behavior. Now, that's true of individuals, but it's also true of groups. The difference is individual violence occurs when people feel they've been humiliated by individuals, and they'll take their anger out in the form of violence on individuals. Whereas collective violence occurs when people, I'd say it only occurs, when an entire group feels insulted by another group, whether it's a racial group, a national group, a religious group, whatever. For example, I'll give you the example of Hitler felt that the entire nation of Germany had been shamed by the Allied powers in the peace treaty that ended World War I. And that stimulated the violence that he organized for the entire nation of Germany to commit in World War II.
Core that he was able to, exacerbate in a sense.
Yeah, and Putin is doing the same thing in Russia.
Right.
Kaiser
Do we
Wilhelm
see that with
II.
our? Oh, I'm sorry. I just want. Do you see that within our own leadership, perhaps too? American?
Well, I'd say that Donald Trump has succeeded in getting many people to follow him. Trump has said pretty much the same thing about the U.S. that Hitler said about Germany. And it's been also effective in promoting and encouraging violence. He said that he said that under the Democrats, America has become the laughingstock of the world, that nobody respects us anymore. And the implication is the solution to that is violence, such as the violence that occurred on January 6th, 2021.
Great. That's a great connection. I place to leave it. We've run out of time, and you're always a joy, and I love you so very much. And
well, thank you, Jim. I love you too, and I'm always good to be here.
I'm so honored and blessed to have you here, and we'll carry on. And thank you so very much again, Jim. And thank you all so very, very much for watching us this week on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
The human soul, the human psyche, needs love in order to survive, just as specifically as the body needs oxygen in order to survive. And for people who haven't been starved for love, that may not be the first thing they would think of. I mean, we kind of take it for granted that we get love from a lot of people. But if you have lived in an environment where you were starved for that, you're talking about a whole different range of experience. Just like with somebody who's starved for oxygen. I mean, most of the time we don't even think about the air we breathe. It's just the air we breathe. But when somebody's oxygen supply is cut off, you realize it's life-threatening in a very short time. Well, the same with the prisoners. They were like people whose oxygen supply had been cut off, but it was their love supply.